Hello everyone, and thank you for joining us for the New Lines Institute for Strategy and Policy Global Hotspots podcast. I'm your host for today, Miłosz Mangiore, and I will be talking to my colleagues Andrew Loftusness and Jared Jeter about some of the key developments this week related to geopolitical hotspots and their implications on global connectivity themes like trade, technology, energy, and climate. As always, you can find a more in-depth analysis and forecast of these topics in our weekly forecast monitor, which we publish every Friday alongside this podcast. Today, lots to cover. We're going to be starting off as usual with a brief roundup of all of our major developments happening in each of our hotspots, which as a reminder are the Middle East, the Indo-Pacific, as well as the Russia-Ukraine conflict. And then we'll take a quick look at some of the developments happening in the UK, Cuba, Pakistan and Afghanistan. And then finally, we'll want to take a deep dive into the long-awaited summit that has happened this week between the presidents of the United States and of China. Let's jump into our roundup. Andrew, start us off with the Middle East and the Russia-Ukraine conflict.
So the Middle East trended towards the status quo this week. Here's why. Trump rejected a peace proposal from Iran, calling it, quote, garbage, and saying that the ceasefire effort itself was on, quote, life support. Despite the president's comments and the rejection of the deal, J.D. Vance said that he felt progress was being made. On May 11th, the EU approved a sanctions package against Israeli settlers targeting both individual leaders and political organizations as well as leaders from Hamas. Israel and Lebanon began a third round of direct peace talks today on May 14th, mediated by the United States in Washington, D.C. The Israelis are expected to propose a phased plan to achieve the disarmament of Hezbollah and increase direct political ties with the Lebanese government. Meanwhile, Israeli forces sustained a wide-scale bombing campaign and issued new civilian evacuation orders across southern Lebanon as Hezbollah conducted drone attacks in northern Israel and clashed with Israeli forces in southern Lebanon. Turning now to Russia and Ukraine, where things have also remained at the status quo both in the Ukraine war and in transatlantic relations. Russia and Ukraine have accused each other of ceasefire violations, and Russia carried out large-scale attacks against Kyiv and numerous other Ukrainian cities. Meanwhile, Putin said on May 9th that he thinks the war in Ukraine is, quote, coming to an end soon. Shortly after those comments, on May 12th, Trump said that he thinks the war will end soon as well, but he also noted that there is no understanding between himself and Putin that Russia will receive the entirety of Ukraine's Donbas region as a condition to end the war. Finally, on May 13th, Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov said that despite public statements about U.S.-Russian relations, quote, nothing is happening in real life to improve the relationship between the two countries. That's all for my sections. Jared, over to you for the Indo-Pacific.
Yeah, in the Indo-Pacific, we've been seeing it trend toward diplomatic de-escalation, as President Trump and President Xi have met in Beijing for their long-awaited summit. The leaders hailed this as a positive and stable step in their relationship. They've been pledging to increase trade and reduce tariffs, although very tough questions on Iran and Taiwan do remain. Just prior to the U.S. visit, the U.S. sanctioned 3 Chinese commercial satellite companies, accusing them of supplying targeting imagery to Iranian forces for the U.S.-Iran war. China has expressed disappointment in the European Union as well for its effort to block investment from China into the bloc to be able to reduce Chinese influence on their economy, and following recent changes made by the EU to its cybersecurity laws. China also stated that it would not allow Taiwan to participate in next week's World Health Organization's annual assembly.
Thank you both. And now turning to the rest of the world to give a quick brief on some of the other hotspots we've been looking at this week. Between the United States and Greenland, we've gotten the news that following threats by the Trump administration earlier this year about annexing Greenland, US officials have confirmed that they were holding continuous high-level talks with Danish and Greenlandic counterparts about a deal that could see an increased US troop number on the island with the consent of all parties involved. And while details remain scarce, talks indicate that there are tentative plans to open 3 new US bases on the island that could be designated as sovereign US territory. In the United States itself, the US Senate narrowly confirmed Kevin Warsh as the new chair of the Federal Reserve. Warsh is replacing Jerome Powell, whose 8-year tenure was marked by repeated clashes with the White House regarding the Fed's independence. Shifting to Cuba, protests broke out in Havana on Wednesday against the government's handling of the deteriorating power situation on the island. The energy minister of the island said that Cuba had completely run out of diesel and fuel. Now, this comes as the US has reiterated its offer to send $100 million in exchange for, quote, meaningful reforms to the communist system. The blackouts have impacted hospitals, schools, and government offices. News from the United Kingdom, where Prime Minister Keir Starmer is facing a renewed wave of pressure to resign following the heavy losses of the governing Labour Party in local elections across England, Scotland, and Wales. The loss has brought out divisions in his party, with nearly 90 members of Parliament urging him to resign, and his Secretary of Health, Wes Streeting, being the first cabinet member to resign as well. The local elections saw big gains made by the far-right Reform Party, as well as the leftist Green Party. And finally, taking a look at the Afghanistan-Pakistan conflict, the Pakistani government summoned a senior Afghan diplomat following a suicide attack in Pakistan's northwest border region that killed 15 police officers. Islamabad blames the Pakistani Taliban and blames Afghanistan for sheltering and aiding the group, an accusation that the government in Kabul repeatedly has denied. Now let's pivot back to a deep dive into this week's discussion. And this week, the biggest event that we've been keeping an eye on has been this long-awaited summit between Trump and Xi, happening currently as we're recording in Beijing. We're recording this on Thursday morning of the 14th of May. Jared, I know that this is something that you've been following quite closely. What is the situation as it stands currently, and what are some of the things that you've been looking at with regards to this summit?
Thanks, Milos. Yeah, the situation for the summit between President Trump and Xi is very interesting, and their positions for both leaders has been evolving as the war in Iran has been progressing. The primary objective, the stated objective, is to discuss issues relating to the economy, for the reduction of tariffs, as well as issues concerning Taiwan. However, the unspoken thing that both parties are definitely looking at here is the way that the Iran war is happening. When the war first started, China was actually benefiting quite a bit diplomatically, as they could posture themselves as the more reasonable large-scale power in the world and somebody that wouldn't be arbitrarily attacking other countries. They also are looking to benefit from a potential mediator role in this conflict, where they can present themselves as one trying to end the war. However, on a diplomatic side, on the economic side, China is a major importer of Iranian oil, and while they've been able to offset that somewhat by increased shipments from Russia, a lot of places, particularly in southern China, have already begun oil rationing. And considering that a lot of China's diplomatic and national narrative around the legitimacy of their regime is based on the standard of living for their people, they really want to see this war end quickly. As far as the other economic measures, particularly that between the tariff fight between America and China right now, China is hoping to walk away from this with a win, some type of reduction in these tariffs, some type of economic situation where even if it's not that materially important, they can point to it and say, we won. We managed to achieve something of importance. And undoubtedly, much like during their first meeting in 2017, President Xi is almost certainly hoping to exploit the more transactional attitudes and nature of the Trump administration to be able to extract some type of an economic or a diplomatic concession by offering the United States something that they would value in return, as opposed to the more ideologically committed U.S. administrations that preceded the Trump administration. So we're likely to see China attempt to push for that type of concession that they can get from the United States, something to reduce the tariffs, or a place where they can take a leading role in mediating the Iran conflict so that they can both benefit from the end of the conflict as well as be able to posture themselves as one of the major drivers of peace in the world. And as far as Taiwan goes, it is very likely that the United States is going to maintain its strategic ambiguity approach. I do not foresee any type of major change to the position of the U.S. on Taiwanese sovereignty. And while China will undoubtedly bring it up, it's very unlikely that we're going to see any major shifts from either side on their positions about Taiwan.
Yeah, thanks, Jared. So, yeah, there's clearly a lot to unpack there, and I think you touched on a few aspects of it, including the trade and commercial side of things. And it should be said that the footage that we received this morning from the summit, it was quite interesting to watch. The Trump administration and the U.S. delegation was met with, the whole foray of red carpet rollouts, military parades, and all of the pre-summit discussions that we were privy to. We saw President Xi and Trump both lavishing each other with praise in terms of the stability of their trade relationship, the fact that they want this to go on for the next couple of years. It's been interesting to see. And on the other hand, as you mentioned, the thorny issues of Taiwan and Iran still remain. And China has definitely made a point this past week of stating that Taiwan is central to the continuation of good relations with the US, meaning that that is definitely their red line that the US shouldn't cross. What is your sense on the Iran issue, though? I mean, you mentioned that the US wants to try and get China more into the fold with regards to pushing for some kind of resolution in Iran, receiving the help of China on that front. But do you think that that is something that's likely to occur? As far as I see it, China is indeed, despite the losses in the oil revenue, there is something to be said about China wanting to perhaps, at the very least, letting things continue the way they are.
Yeah, so in general, the U.S. doesn't want China to take a leading role in the peace process. China is interested in posturing itself as a defender of global peace and as a mediator of global conflicts. And they have made subtle overtures to be able to say that they are willing to help try to mediate the conflict in some capacity. And what you just brought up is very interesting and very important. So there's kind of two sides to this. The first is that China wants the conflict to continue for a couple of reasons. One, it diverts and siphons a lot of American equipment and material and attention away from the Indo-Pacific area, which will make China's strategic position there much stronger and make any potential hand in any future coercive action against any of its neighbors more achievable without too much of the way of American security assistance in the region. It also makes China look just more reasonable and more diplomatically viable on the world stage. So in these capacities, China is actually interested in this conflict continuing. However, despite their increased oil imports from Russia, China itself is already starting to see rationing, particularly in the southern areas, as I mentioned. China is not in favor economically of this happening. So this is kind of a conflict between the Chinese business class and the Politburo itself. The larger geostrategic objectives of China benefit from this war continuing for a longer period of time. However, China's economic well-being and the geopolitical considerations and stability of their country they have to consider from that economic well-being is being harmed by the Iran war. So China really is kind of torn a little bit on how to approach this. But for now, they seem to be making public overtures that they wish to help mediate the end of the conflict, while also quietly benefiting from aspects of America militarily reduced in certain capacities.
Yeah, and not to mention the fact that China is undoubtedly getting a trove of intelligence as to how the United States conducts multi-domain operations and how the US is actually going to deal with the issue of resupplying the weaponry that it has been using against Iran. All intelligence that would be very useful to China if it ever came to gaming out a potential contingency in the Indo-Pacific.
And we have some breaking news on some interesting events that are actually happening. This was just released about 30 minutes ago from the China summit. A direct quote from President Xi Jinping regarding a potential U.S. conflict over Taiwan. President Xi directly just said that the relationship between China and the U.S. remains generally stable. However, the two countries will have clashes or even conflicts, putting the entire relationship in great jeopardy. That is a direct quote from President Xi, and seeming to be a escalation in the rhetoric that we have seen from this summit. This is probably one of the most, if not the most, escalatory comment we have seen from either leader so far at this meeting.
Yeah, it's a shame that we're recording this right in the middle of the summit actually happening. Obviously we'll get more updates by the end of it, so by the end of Friday, tomorrow. It is a notable piece of rhetoric there. I do think that it's probably, this is something that isn't new, right? Insofar as this is the Chinese Communist Party line in terms of, Taiwan is the red line, absolutely. And we know that the US is trying to, or rather, we know that China really wants the US to alter its language with regards to Taiwan. And actually, Jared, for people who may not be as aware, can you give us an idea of what that kind of language alterations could be and could signify?
Yeah, generally speaking, both sides try to maintain very strong ambiguity in their language. China consistently maintains that they reserve the right to use force to be able to reacquire Taiwan at a later date. Now, while this type of hostile rhetoric from the Chinese side and the extremely vague and ambiguous language from the US side is hardly uncommon, it's a little atypical for messages of and narratives of direct conflict between the two states to be brought up during a summit. This certainly wasn't the case during the last 2017 summit. So while this type of behavior is not particularly new, I would say that it is noteworthy that this is being said directly to President Trump's face during this meeting.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. And it's definitely a deviation from the tone that we've seen earlier today, where, as I mentioned, there was all the positivity and the fanfare surrounding the trade relations. And now seemingly they've, at the very least, broached the subjects of the more geopolitically contentious disagreements between US and China.
Yeah, I would also like to point out that prior to this summit, both from representatives of the US and China as well as the leaders themselves, they both made it very clear that issues like potential conflict over Taiwan were not going to be discussed. And now both sides now seem to be engaging in this. So there seems to be a pretty hard deviation from the agenda items as well, which is, again, rather atypical of these type of high-level summits.
Well, it was interesting just the day before the summit that Trump himself said that he was going to talk about Taiwanese arms sales with Xi, which is itself quite a breaking of the norms, right? Because I don't think China has ever been included in negotiations over what weaponry gets sent over to Taiwan and at what point does it get sent. And obviously this is just because China has made it quite clear that that's something they really don't want the US to keep doing, or to at the very least tread very carefully while doing. So quite a breaking of convention all around, it seems.
Yes, and you're absolutely right. And while that might have potentially been an offhand comment from the president, it is undoubtable that that is going to have an effect on the U.S.-Taiwanese relationship, as Taiwan, particularly the Green Party, the DPP, typically views these type of comments as a bit of a betrayal or a bit of a pulling away from Taiwanese sovereignty. This also might have larger implications for the Taiwanese political sphere, in that comments like these tend to help the KMT politically, as it provides more ammunition for the concept that America will not be a reliable strategic partner going forward.
Yeah, and obviously has consequences for the rest of the Indo-Pacific if this were to manifest. I mean, if the US were to alter its language on Taiwan, the implications for Japan, for South Korea, for the Philippines would also be noted. But at the same time, I think that unless Trump really goes his own way, I think there's some quite substantial institutional backing with regards to the US's stance on Taiwan. I mean, we know that the US's support of Taiwan is enshrined in US law, and it has the backing of essentially most lawmakers within US Congress, and all the implications that we talked about obviously factor in all of this. So I think this may be albeit China is demanding more concessions from the US on Taiwan, I think that this may end up being the intractable thing that it always becomes. What we may see is perhaps a delay in the latest US weapons sale. What are your thoughts?
No, you're absolutely right. And this is what I was kind of saying earlier, that the type of signals that we're seeing indicate that we're not going to be seeing any type of major shift in either direction from either party about the policy on Taiwan. Things are likely to remain pretty solid. The major change or implication that could occur is not actually in material diplomatic relations or even in military arms sales. The major implication that we could see is likely within Taiwan itself, as they are in the middle of a very fierce, polarized political battle about messaging and about who is going to be best serving the interests of Taiwan. And these type of comments, as I said, do provide ammunition and a lot of political benefits for the narrative of the KMT. So the biggest change that comments like these are likely to be narrative-based and political, particularly on the island of Taiwan.
Definitely. So something to keep an eye on. And just to bring it back to what we were saying on Iran, I think this clearly shows that both sides have something they want from each other, the US being China's support on Iran, and China being a disengagement from the US in some capacity with Taiwan. And it's likely that whoever asks that from the other first is going to receive a response from the other, which may mean that we may not get much progress on either, if that makes sense. So just to round up, for the moment, it's seeming progress on the trade front. The truce between the US and China is likely to continue, the trade truce, that is. And we'll have to stay tuned tomorrow to see whether anything changes on the geopolitical front. But with that, we'll have to wrap it up for today. And as a reminder to our listeners, if you'd like a more in-depth analysis and forecasting related to what we just talked about, to all the topics that we talked about today, please check out the weekly forecast monitor on our website at newlinesinstitute.org, where you can also register to receive our weekly newsletter and access to our geopolitical forecasting platform for real-time updates around the world. Thank you, Andrew. Thank you, Jared. And thank you all for listening, and take care.